It was a cold Halloween evening in the desert. Two gentlemen had just traveled halfway across the country to join me on an outing they'd hopefully never forget. In the end, it would be a life-changing evening for both of them. They were both in their mid-20s and were lifelong friends. Though they had grown up and done everything together, only one of them was a believer. Because of their strong friendship, I didn't understand how their beliefs about aliens and Bigfoot could be so different. You know, as our beliefs are largely determined from our experiences and environment. So with that always being the same with them, you could call me surprised. It was 9 p.m. and our destination was about 20 miles into the middle of the desert, so we climbed into my vehicle and set off through town. During the drive, I asked them both questions to help me get to know them a bit better. Mostly, I was curious about why the skeptic agreed to the expense of flying across the country on his buddy's quest into the unknown. I never really got a straight answer, so I left it at that. I did learn that it took a lot of convincing for the skeptic to come along with us that night. The moon was full and bright, lighting up the driveway in front of us. "Okay, we're here," I said. My two guests opened their doors and looked around outside. "So, this is the famous ranch?" asked the skeptic. "Yep," I replied. "It's been abandoned for many years now." I was at the back of the truck, going through bins of equipment for items we'd need. I called them over and handed them warm winter jackets. "Put these on. It's only going to get colder tonight." I also handed each of them a couple of granola bars and a bottle of water, as well as a flashlight. "Okay, are you guys ready?" I asked. They both nodded their heads. I proceeded to lead them up the dirt road to an old locked gate bearing no trespassing signs, where I gave them a lay of the land and go over what I had planned for them. Before I lead you to the back of the property, I want to share some stories with you. Take this gate, for instance. It's always locked. One evening, a young couple noticed from a distance it appeared to be unlocked. As they approached to get a better look, the gate mysteriously opened wide, as if inviting them in. During another visit, a man rested up against it while the group he was with talked. Suddenly, he was thrown back away from the gate as if someone had pushed the gate with tremendous force from the other side. Understandably, he didn't go near the gate again. Both men stepped back away from the gate and looked it over. I'm sure they were wondering if I was trying to pull their leg. It's also not uncommon to hear footsteps approaching the gate from the other side, but you cannot see anyone, I added. We've also had those invisible people out here walking around our groups and vehicles. Just then, all three of us felt a cold chill as the wind picked up. We zipped our coats up even higher, and they commented on how they were glad to have the jackets. They never thought it got so cold in the desert. The believer asked, "Is there something special we need to do to make contact?" I mean, I've been asking in my thoughts for a sign or something, that they're here with us, but I'm not getting an answer. I believe something will happen, but I'm not picking up on anything. I know most people feel seeing is believing, and therefore they always want to see a sign, but I suggest you not rely only on the sense of vision. Instead, be open to your other senses like touch, smell, and hearing. For the next 10 minutes, they asked about all the things they'd heard about the ranch and if they really happened. As I pointed out where each of those events took place, an unexpected feeling came over me. "Do you guys feel that?" I asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, are you still cold, or do you feel like it's suddenly 70 degrees? They laughed. "Yeah, you're right." I laughed with them, and the three of us unzipped our heavy jackets. It was no longer in the 30s, and we welcomed the change. "There's something else happening," I added. "Do you feel comfortable? Like we could stand here talking all night, and you don't need to sit down or go to the bathroom?" "Yeah," said the believer. "My legs aren't feeling so stiff, and my back feels relaxed." "Mine too," added his friend. At that point, I said, "Stay here for a minute." They watched as I walked slowly back up the road toward the vehicle, then stopped, took a few steps backward, then a few steps forward, a few steps back, and then extended my arm out in front of me. When I returned, I said, "I'll explain in a minute, but first, I want each of you to, one at a time, do what I just did. Walk slowly, being very aware of the temperature, the silence, and that there is currently zero wind blowing on us. As you walk, do so until you feel the wind and cold. Then, step backwards out of that cold and then forward into the cold. They looked at each other and then at me as if I were crazy. Smiling, I said, "Trust me." The believer went first. His friend and I stayed at the gate and watched as he did as instructed. He came back smiling. I put my finger up to my lips as if asking him to not say anything. "Okay, it's your turn," I said to the skeptic. He walked past his friend and ended up stopping at the same point as us, some 30 feet away. "What is this?" he asked. I pointed up at the sky and asked them if they could see any airplanes flying overhead or any satellites. "Can you hear anything, such as wind, insects, or coyotes?" I asked them. They both said no and asked what that meant. I answered with a question. "Have you heard of people that had Bigfoot encounters saying that everything around them went suddenly quiet first?" "Yes," they both answered. "Well," I replied, "that's what is happening right now, only you're noticing more of the finer details." I continued, "For example, when some people report the strange and sudden silence, it's often followed up with an equally sudden but terrifying scream or crash of a tree or rock, forcing them to quickly leave the area. They may even see the creature. At that moment in their life, they're only concerned with their safety and don't really pay attention to the finer details like you just experienced. Neither of you are in that flight or fight mode. This phenomenon happens so often out here, you might even expect it," I said. "Has it really happened to you before?" asked the skeptic. "Yes, many times, in fact." I continued, "However, the details vary. For instance, it's typically reported as a prelude to a Bigfoot encounter, but I've had it happen during other activities, not just with Bigfoot. While people report the sudden silence, as if the wind and all living things in the forest collude to go quiet at the same time, my experience has been that it's more like a giant invisible bubble which descends upon us, and within that bubble, reality can be different for the people inside it." "What do you mean, exactly?" asked the believer. "It's hard to explain, but you both have just experienced what I did, that you walked over there and found the edge of something. Here within the something, it is currently warm and comfortable. Outside the invisible something, we all felt the same cold and wind, right?" They nodded in agreement. "Think about this for a moment," I added. "If the forest goes silent during a Bigfoot encounter, how far does that silence extend? I mean, does it go out over the entire planet or to the nearest city, and why is that? It's like one of those things people don't think about." I continued, "So, what if all of that activity happens under a sort of invisible dome or bubble so that only those who are supposed to experience it do?" I asked them. "It's like we had this experience here at the gate and people over at the vehicle didn't. How is that?" Just then, the invisible something which had descended over us began to lift, and the cold wind returned. We all felt it, and looking up, we could once more see airplanes flying overhead, and we heard coyotes yipping in the distance. "See what I mean?" I asked them. "Do you believe that warmth and comfort we just experienced was felt by everyone in town or just us? And I bet people in town could see and hear those airplanes overhead while standing here under this invisible something we couldn't. That is, until it lifted. I guess it makes sense that it was just over us," said the believer, as it was like it came and went. The skeptic added, "And we found the edge of it over there." "Exactly," I replied. "The people who used to live here once said that while out in the yard behind the house, one person saw two dinosaurs back there by the trees, and when she yelled to the other person who was standing about 20 feet away, they didn't hear her yelling their name or see anything unusual. The bubbles can be as small or large as needed. I've even felt the edge of something like this much larger around a city, where I drove through it to get inside, as it were, from the north, and again while leaving town to the west," I added. "But that story's for another time. We've got more to do tonight," I told them. "Let's head around back," I said, while illuminating the trail. About 5 minutes later, we crested the top of the hill, which allowed us a view of the abandoned home. Before we reached the backyard, We were stopped in our tracks by the sound of something very large stomping on the ground, grunting, and breaking branches in the trees ahead of us. It was almost like something large was stuck in the trees and was trying to get out. Adding to the strangeness, not one of the trees moved or swayed with all that racket taking place. "This is turning out to be a fun Halloween for you guys, huh?" I asked. "What is it?" asked the skeptic. "Let's wait and see if it makes its way out into the open," I replied. Normally, we wouldn't be able to see much at night, even from the elevation of the hill, but the moon was full and lit up the entire desert below. The crashing and branch snapping sounds continued for about a minute and then stopped. That's when the three of us hiked down the hill and toward the grove of trees. As we walked around to the backside, we could tell that was where the sounds had originated, but nothing was there. In fact, there were no broken branches or tree limbs on the ground anywhere. "So what just happened?" asked the believer. "The only thing I can think of is that a Sasquatch might have been back here." "Why do you say that?" asked the friend. "Well, this property has had Bigfoot activity, as reported by the former homeowner. In fact, she reported that her very first encounter happened in a similar manner, but I don't know where on the ranch it took place. Before that, she didn't know she had Bigfoot hanging around." I continued. She said that she heard loud sounds from branches being broken, stomping sounds, etc., just like what happened here with us. She would later have many encounters with a female Sasquatch, so she naturally made the connection. I will add that I've brought people out here before, and when talking about the area's female Sasquatch, we received vocalizations and other noises from various parts of the ranch. Once we heard noises coming from the parking area where we parked. When we returned to the vehicle, we did look for footprints, but didn't find any. The three of us stayed a bit longer just talking and looking around before heading back to the locked gate. That's when things really took a turn for the paranormal. I heard one of the guys unexpectedly say, "I have this compelling urge to climb over the gate and go up to the house." When I turned to see who said it, it was the non-believer, the skeptic. "What?" I responded. "Yeah, I can't explain it. It's a really strong feeling that I can't shake," he reiterated. His friend, the believer, asked, "What do you mean, a feeling you can't shake?" "It's like I'm being called or beckoned to the house," he answered. We watched as the man made his way up the drive to the house. We both remained silent and turned our hearing sensitivity to the maximum in case we needed to go after him. I couldn't help but recall all the instances where someone or something made it very clear they didn't want people on their side of the fence. The simple fact he was allowed to make it to the house was curious, to say the least. Neither his friend nor I appeared to have been invited in. A few minutes later, he returned, and we moved away from the gate and back to the vehicle. "So, what happened? Did you see anything?" asked his friend. "Yeah, what happened?" I added. "Well, all the way up to the house I continued to feel the strong need to keep going and that I would be all right. When I reached the front of the house and was about to step up onto the porch, I heard noises coming from inside the house." "What sort of noises?" his friend asked. "It sounded like something fell over onto the floor, and then I heard someone running away from the window. It was like someone was inside and watched me approach the house. As soon as I moved toward the porch like I was going to go in, they ran away to hide." That's when I asked, "Did the running sound like an animal or human, like an adult or child?" "It wasn't very loud and was like quick, short steps, so maybe a child. It was definitely on 2 feet." "Did you go inside?" asked his friend. "No. Something said I'd gone far enough, but I did look inside the window." "What did you see?" I asked. "It was dark, but I could make out a kind of bar like in a saloon with pop bottles on it as well as toy cars on the floor under the window." "Do you still feel anything, like that urge to go to the house?" his friend asked. "No, it's gone." Before we packed up, I asked them both a question. "You guys seem to know a lot about the ranch. Have you ever heard the story about the boy with a scooter?" They both shook their heads. "What is it?" asked the believer. "I'll tell you, then we'll drive back home. It's already pretty late." As the story goes, 2 guys drove out here during the day. About a mile from the house, they noticed a young boy walking alongside the road. He was carrying a scooter. The guys in the car thought it weird, as they were in the desert and at least 20 miles from any paved surface, so where could he be going with a scooter? When they pulled up to the boy, they asked if he was okay or needed a ride. The boy said yes, he was fine and that his scooter was broken, so he would like a ride. "Where are you going?" "Up to the house," as he pointed in the direction they were headed. This made their hair stand up, as they knew nobody lived there and all the stories they ever heard about the place were strange and paranormal. They were also curious, so they opened the door and let the boy in. They stopped at the same locked gate and asked the boy if that was where he was going. He said yes and got out. He looked back at the guys and invited them up to the house for some soda pop and to play with cars. That was too much for them, so they declined and let the boy go. They watched in silence as he crawled under the gate and made his way up to the house. I continued, "It's interesting that you saw pop bottles on the counter and also toy cars, not to mention hearing what sounded like a child running through the house." They both looked at me in disbelief. "You're kidding, right?" asked the believer. "Nope. That's a report two guys made of their experience, so unless they lied, it could be true. Let's get out of here," I added. "It's already midnight and I'm cold." Now, at this point, you might think this was all a bit much and probably not true. I assure you, this all happened, as well as what I'm about to conclude with. The events of their evening didn't end there. While at work about a month later, I got a call from the skeptic guy. He was upset and wanted me to tell him what happened to his friend. I had no idea what he was talking about. "He hasn't come home," he told me. "We were supposed to fly back on the same flight, but after that night at the ranch, he told me he wanted to extend his stay a bit longer and that he'd fly home later." Then he dropped a bombshell. "Did he tell you what happened after we got back to the hotel that night?" "No," I answered. "I haven't seen or heard from him since I dropped you guys off." "What happened?" "We returned to our hotel room and were getting into bed while remarking about some of the stuff that happened at the ranch. I was in my bed, which was closest to the window, and he was in his, next to the bathroom. Suddenly, we both heard what sounded like some sort of humming ship descend and stop just outside the window by my bed." He paused for a moment, then told me I was terrified and there was no way in hell I wanted to see what was going to happen. I wanted no part of it. He was obviously still upset about it. "So, what happened then?" I asked. I put my head under the blanket and refused to look, saying out loud, "Oh hell no." Then in the morning, my friend told me two beings from the craft floated across the room to visit with him. It was then he decided to stay behind. That's when he asked me again, "So what the hell happened?" He seemed different in some way, and I got the feeling that we could no longer be friends. I really have no idea. Have you heard from him? Has he called? No. The last thing he said was that he wanted to stay behind for a while longer to explore his spiritual journey and would return home in a couple of weeks, but he hasn't returned. I really didn't know what to say, other than assure him that if I saw his friend or heard from him, I'd be sure to have him call home. I never did see him again, and that was also the last I'd heard from his friend.